expanded upon.
Other questions? There is a question that some of the students sent questions ahead of time, and this person writes, how long did it take you to write this book, including your research?
So this was not planned, but the novel actually took me 10 years, which is the same length as the Trojan War, not on purpose. I sort of feel like I've been researching this book my whole life, actually. I've loved these stories since I was very young. I studied them in high school, I studied them in college, I studied them in graduate school. What was interesting, or what was, I think, strange, is that this whole time that I was studying classics, I was also writing, but I wasn't writing about the ancient world. I was writing personal essays, I was writing short stories set in the modern world. I never even considered writing about the classical world. They were just totally separate things for me. And then I kind of had this epiphany, oh, I can write about ancient Greece. And so it was that kind of sent me into writing about it. And I was very fortunate to have done all this research ahead of time, not really knowing it was research. I had been to Greece. I lived in Greece for a summer and worked on an archaeological dig. That was very important. I don't think I could have written the novel if I had not spent time in Greece. If any of you ever get the opportunity to go to Greece, go. It is so beautiful and amazing, and the food is fabulous.
Other questions? Yes, come right down here. This is a baseball player from Wentworth.
What really intrigued me was the legendary fight between Hector and Achilles was only like half a page. Mm-hmm. And before that, he had like a really long fight with a river god. So why was like all the emphasis on that fight instead of the fight between Hector and Achilles?
That's a great question. And by the way, if we're looking for sort of modern day version of Greek heroes, I would say that sort of the equivalent in our culture of ancient Greek heroes is the athletes. They're not soldiers anymore, but these extraordinary athletes. So you're right in line to be a Greek hero in the modern world. So what's interesting about ancient fighting techniques is that when we think of sort of battles between soldiers, we think of maybe the Hollywood version or maybe the medieval version where you have people with giant swords just wailing on each other for, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. The ancient style of fighting doesn't actually lend itself very well to Hollywood or to movies because it is largely with spears, and it's not, the whole thing that you often see, which is like staff to staff fighting with the spears, where it's like clack, 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 that kind of thing. It was, I throw my spear at you, and it either hits you or it misses you. And if it hits you, it either pierces your armor or it doesn't. And that was sort of the fight. And then if I miss you, I get another spear, and I try again. And that kind of went back and forth. And so when we're talking about the Homeric style of fighting, these battles weren't necessarily that long. And in the Iliad, it's also pretty short as well. Most of the fight is taken up with Hector running away from Achilles. Hector runs and runs and runs, but of course you cannot run Achilles. That's what he's best at. Right, speed. So there's a long time of Achilles chasing Hector, but when they finally stop, when Hector's so exhausted he can't run anymore, they finally stop. The battle itself happens pretty quickly. And interestingly enough, the first blow that Achilles takes, the first spear he throws, or the spear that hits Hector, it's a fatal wound. So that's it. He hits him, Hector's dead. It's a fatal wound. There are other epics, for example, Virgil's Aeneid, that end with a little bit more of a complicated ending where you have two heroes facing off. One hero throws his spear. It hits the other hero in the leg. So now you have an interesting moment. because a leg wound is not a fatal wound. Now, you could get gangrene and you could die later from infection, but in the moment, it's not a fatal wound. So now the hero who has thrown the spear has a choice. Okay, I've wounded him, he can't fight anymore. It's a major wound. Do I kill him or not? So there's kind of an interesting moral question. Do you ransom him? Does he beg for mercy, right? There's an interaction there. Homer cuts all that off. Achilles throws the spear, it's fatal. Hector dies. He sort of is able to have a few more moments of life, but that's it for him. So I was really just following the Iliad in that case. It's a very short fight. And the fight with the river god is much longer in the Iliad. And it's much longer because we finally see Achilles facing a god. And in some ways, it's a more interesting fight. Hector doesn't really ever have a chance. You know, as much as I really like Hector, and I think he's a really fascinating figure in the Iliad, but let's face it, he's all human, and Achilles is half god. And that's not really a fair fight. And we've already seen in the Iliad, we see Hector go up against Ajax. Ajax is the second best warrior in the Greek army. And the two of them basically fight each other to a draw. So if it's a tie with the second best guy, it's over for Hector when he meets Achilles. Great question.
Other questions? I have a question from the students, which is, why does Thetis always show bitter feelings towards Patroclus?
So the gods are really interesting figures in the ancient world. They are terrifying. You never want to be on a god's bad side, and sometimes even if you're on a god's good side, it ends up badly for you in the ancient world. One of my favorite stories when I was thinking about the gods and writing Thetis and creating the character of a goddess is actually the story of Zeus, who comes down, he's king of the gods. He comes down and in the stories, he sleeps with tons and tons and tons of mortal women for the supposed idea of creating all these heroes. So one of the mortal women that he sleeps with, her name is Semele, and she gets pregnant. She's actually pregnant with the god Dionysus. And she says to him, I'm pregnant with your child. I want you to grant me a favor, Zeus. And he says, anything, I'll do anything for you. You're pregnant with my son, anything you want. And she says, I want you to reveal yourself to me in your full glory. And Zeus says, trust me, you really don't want me to do that. Please, don't ask for anything else. And she says, you promised, you said you would do anything I wanted, and that's what I want. I want you to reveal yourself to me in your full glory. So Zeus says, well, okay, I'll do it. And he reveals himself in his full glory to her, and she incinerates in front of him. And her baby is left lying on the ground, and this is sort of a weird part of the story, but he sews the baby up in his leg, and then the baby is born from his leg, so that part gets a little strange. But the point of the story is that if you don't want to mess with the gods, and that when the gods are truly in their power, they are overwhelming. You can't stand in front of them as a human being. However, an interesting thing about the Greek gods is that they are very hierarchical, right? So you have Zeus as the king of the gods, who is all-powerful. If you see him, you explode, you incinerate, you burst into flames. But Thetis is many, many, many layers down from that. She's a sea nymph. She's not one of the major goddesses. She is sort of one of the very minor goddesses. And in that position, she has only some powers. So her greatest wish, Thetis' greatest wish, is to make Achilles a god. She wants her son to live. She's a goddess, right? She should be able to get what she wants. But she can't. She spends the whole Iliad and the whole book and all of mythology trying to save Achilles' life. And even though she's a goddess, she can't do it. She also has a really sad backstory to her and the way Achilles was conceived. It's told differently in different myths, but let's be honest, in most of them, Achilles is the product of rape. She's raped by a human. She's given to a human by the gods without her consent. He rapes her, and she conceives Achilles. So you can understand why she might have some pretty negative feelings towards mortals, as well as the fact that she doesn't have a lot of power herself, that even though she's supposedly a goddess, should supposedly be able to do anything that she wants, she can't. She can't. So I think that there's that aspect to her hating mortals. I also think that one of the stories about the gods in the ancient world is that they are incredibly jealous. They are incredibly jealous. So whenever you have a god, if a god loves you, do not make eyes at anybody else because they're going to be toast. Gods do not brook their favorites looking at anyone else. And so I also think that Thetis in hating Patroclus is feeling that jealousy, that the gods feel that passionate jealousy, as well as her general distaste for mortals.
Good. Other questions from the audience? I'd rather take questions from you than from here. Yes? Can you come over here?
Okay. Yeah, you can just shout.
Did the success of Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson series help you think that this might be a successful novel?
So often, most of the time that I was working on the novel, I actually wasn't even aware of his books. I think his books started coming out right as I was going into the publication process. One of the things about publication is that, in our instant world, we sort of expect, the writer finishes the last word, you hit save, you send it off to the publisher, and, it's out in a couple weeks. The publishing process is still one of the slowest processes out there. So it took, from the time that the publishing house bought my book, it was another 2 years until it came out. So there was a lot of, he was writing, and he writes very quickly, and so there were a lot of his books that were coming out kind of all through that process. So I wasn't even aware of those, but I'm very grateful because I do think that they paved the way for this general renaissance of interest in classics. I think Hollywood has done its part there. I hear that there's a class that is focused on classics in the movies, the 300, obviously, Gladiator. So I think there's been kind of this general cultural resurgence of the classics, which I'm very grateful for. And as a teacher, I have all kinds of students who come to my classes having read, the Percy Jackson books. So I'm also grateful as a teacher because it's a wonderful background for people who are interested in it.
There's one question here that the student submitted to an English class, and it says, if you had to do it all over again, would there have been anything you would have changed?
That is a brutal question to ask a writer, let me tell you. Because writers tend to be perfectionists. I imagine people who work in engineering and technology, I imagine there are a lot of perfectionists in this room, actually. And with writing, it's subjective, and you want to write it absolutely the best that you can in the moment, but hopefully as a writer, you're always growing and you're always getting better. And so, 10 years after you finish a novel and you look back on it, I imagine there are going to be sentences I read where I think, wow, I could do that better now. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. It means I'm growing as a writer, but it's also an excruciatingly painful thing to be aware of, because you can't really fix it. Maybe I could write into the publisher and say, for the next printing, could you fix this word? But I think that also one of the things about writing a novel is that you put your all into it. You live in that world completely. You immerse yourself. Achilles and Patroclus were running through my thoughts, constantly. I was living in that world, and I had to write it as best as I could in that moment while I was living in that world. And then at some point I had to say, okay, this is as good as I can get it. I'm finished. I've worked on this for 10 years. Now I move on to the next thing. And I'm not in that world anymore. I think that now if I tried to write the book, I couldn't, because I'm not totally immersed in it. Now I'm immersed in my next novel. And so I think that that's how it should be, that in a sense, if I were to go back over the novel line by line, I'm sure I would find things here and there that I would want to change. But I think I put my 100% into the novel when I did it, when I was totally immersed in it, and I think that has to stand. I wouldn't want to go back and mess with it later now in some other frame of mind.
We only have time for a couple more questions. Yes, young man.
What sparked your interest in Greek mythology?
So when I was 5 and 6 years old, my mom used to read me the Iliad and the Greek myths as bedtime stories. And my mom really doesn't like that because she doesn't like me to tell that story because she thinks it makes her sound really inappropriate. Because as I've told you, there's plenty of like exploding organs and gore and blood and killing and rage all throughout these stories. But I think what appealed to me in her reading those to me was actually just that first line of the Iliad, which is, "Sing, goddess, of the destructive rage of Achilles." And there was something about that. You know, when you're 5 years old, when you're 6 years old, the stories that you tend to read The Runaway Bunny and Goodnight Moon, right? And those are wonderful stories, and I'm sure I will read those to my kids, and my mom read those to me as well. But it's very different from "Sing, goddess, of the destructive rage of Achilles." And there was something about Achilles' flaw. It's right there in the first line, his rage, that's going to bring destruction not only on the enemy, but on his own people. And I think I was really, all of a sudden, it got my attention. I felt like, oh my gosh, this is the real world. This is what people are like. They get angry and they make horrible choices, and hopefully they can move on from that. But I think it was the complexity and the flawed nature of the heroes that really drew me in. They felt like real people to me.
Any other questions? Yes.
So the question was, why did I pick the title Song of Achilles? So the word Iliad, the Iliad, actually means the Song of Troy. Ili is the word for Troy, and ad comes down to English in our word ode. I don't know if you ever heard the word, like singing an ode to someone. So Iliad itself means the Song of Troy. And poetry in the ancient world, another word for poetry was song. So poems were referred to as songs. And so I sort of like the idea of keeping song in there, in the title. And of course, Achilles himself is a singer. That's another thing that interested me about Achilles, other than his rage and his flaws and his complexity, is the fact that in another life, Achilles could have been a wonderful singer. He could have been a doctor, right? Killing wasn't his only talent. He was the most beautiful singer of the Greeks, and he was also one of the most skilled physicians and healers. And so I wanted that aspect of his personality in there as well.
Other questions? Yes.
I really liked what you did after Patroclus died, sort of like how you told the story from his point of view still, but like as like a wandering spirit or something. So I was wondering how you came to the decision of telling the story that way and in that point of the story.
That was something I really struggled with, actually. What happens when your first-person narrator dies 3/4 of the way through the story? How do you get that last quarter of the story in there? I experimented with a lot of different possibilities. I actually wrote 3 or 4 different versions of the ending. I wrote one where Achilles took over. I wrote one where a couple other characters took over the narration, where Briseis took over the narration. However, it was clear to me from the moment that I finished writing each of those versions that they were completely wrong. It just didn't work at all, that it really needed to be Patroclus. He was the spirit of the novel all the way through. And luckily for me, that works with the Greek belief in the afterlife, which was that if you were not properly buried, your spirit still existed. And even if you were properly buried and your spirit was in the underworld, you still retained all your memories, all your thoughts about life. So I was fortunate to be able to get help from the way the Greeks actually believed about the dead. And so that was, once I kind of came to that understanding, it was Patroclus all the way. But one of the most interesting things about Patroclus in the afterlife, one of the most interesting tidbits actually comes from the Odyssey. So in the Odyssey tells the story of Odysseus trying to get home after the Trojan War, and it takes him 10 years also. And along his many, many travels and travails, he meets tons of monsters, and he actually goes down to the underworld at some point. And in the underworld, he sees Achilles and Patroclus down there, their spirits. And he says to Achilles, he talks to the spirit of Achilles, and he says, Achilles, here you are in the underworld. You're king of the dead. You have exactly what you wanted. You're the most famous warrior that ever lived. It must feel great. And Achilles says, no, don't say that to me. I made the wrong choice. It's better to be alive and to be nothing than to be king of the dead. And that really stuck with me because, of course, all throughout the Iliad, all we hear about is Achilles' choice for fame, for fame, for fame. He's going to die young, but he's going to be famous. And then when we meet his spirit in the afterlife, in the Odyssey, he says, I made the wrong choice. So that was very much with me also as I was writing about Patroclus as a spirit, that I wanted that sort of to be hanging over Achilles and Patroclus. I don't tell that part of the story, but it was very much, I wanted my Achilles, if we did check in on him 5 years later, to say that.
Okay, we have time for maybe one more question before the author. Yes?
What were some struggles in developing the plot or aspects of it?
For me, I think the hardest thing was actually finding Patroclus's voice. So the plot, a lot of the plot was laid out for me already, in that I knew we were going to the Trojan War, I knew there was going to be 10 years of the war, I knew Troy was going to fall. So some of the basic building blocks were laid out, but as I talked about, there were lots of different versions of the myths that I could pick and choose from. So that was sometimes a little bit of a challenge. But honestly, the biggest challenge wasn't in terms of the plot, it was really Patroclus's voice and the way Patroclus spoke. So I wrote a whole version of this novel, and about 5 years into my 10-year process, I found an agent, and I was ready to go to publishers, and somewhere in that process, I reread the book again to make sure it was really ready for publishers, and I realized with this horrible sinking feeling that it was completely wrong, and I hated it. So I threw out that entire draft, and I started over from scratch. And what you're reading is actually the second 5 year, the second version of it that took me the second 5 years. And what was wrong with it was the voice. That I had been so drawn into Homer's world and to the Iliad and to the epic style of speaking. And when I talk about the epic style, I think a really good modern analogy is Lord of the Rings. Have you all seen the Lord of the Rings movies? Okay, so that's modern epic, right? The characters always speak like they're standing on a stage and orating, right? Everyone says these really epic things, right? Swords and battles, that style, that formal, high-flown style, that epic style, that was really the style I was writing in. And what I realized was that was completely wrong for Patroclus. Patroclus is not an epic person. He's pulled into the epic world because he loves Achilles, but it is not where he naturally belongs. So I really needed to find a different voice for Achilles. I needed to find a non-epic voice, and eventually I found one. I looked to the world of ancient lyric poetry. Lyric poetry is the opposite of epic. Lyric poetry is the poetry of friendship and love and, dinner parties with your friends and hanging out and sex. It's all that stuff. And so I thought that's where Patroclus's voice comes from, not the world of epic, but the world of lyric.
We're going to close before we say thank you to Madeline. She's going to be signing in the front just for a few minutes if you want to get your book signed. Thank you, Madeline.
Thank you all so much.